John 19, beginning with verse 23, is where we read these words. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." This was to fulfill the scripture which says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." So the soldiers did these things. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her home to his own home. This is the word of the Lord. I didn't think it would really be a day that changed history when the day started off. It seemed like a regular day, like many other days that I had experienced. It was during the Passover season in the land of Judea. I'd been assigned several years earlier to serve the Roman Empire in that land. And let me tell you, serving in Judea was not a particularly nice post for us soldiers. In other areas of the Roman Empire, soldiers were viewed with a kind of reverent fear and respect. And I'd always wanted to be a soldier because of that respect. When you became a soldier, you had access, you had power, you had prestige, you were viewed with a kind of dignity and awe. Nobody would intimidate you and nobody stood in your way. And I had always wanted that. But in Judea, they seemed to view us differently. In the land of Judea, Roman soldiers weren't viewed with a kind of reverent fear and respect. And on the day that we were called in, we were told that we were going to be involved in another crucifixion. This was the death sentence of preference in Rome, and it was often what my job entailed. Crucifixion was a cruel death. It took anywhere for those who had been convicted and to sentenced to crucifixion, it took anywhere from a few hours to a little over a day for death to occur, and it was a painful process. Crucifixion was only reserved for the most shameful of convicted felons. It was brutal, it was shameful, and it wasn't just meant to carry out justice. What you have to understand is that when we carried out a crucifixion for the Roman Empire, we were sending a message. And that message was, you didn't cross us. You didn't stand against the Roman Empire. In the land of Judea, they struggled to understand that. They looked at us Roman soldiers as a kind of interference. They wanted to worship their God alone, and they didn't want us to be involved in that process of how they lived their lives. They felt that they were a chosen people, that they were special. And on that night, when we were called to do our job, we were shown the conviction. The convicted man's name was Jesus. And we saw the sign that was to be hung above his head. The sign said he was the King of the Jews. And I couldn't help but wonder, what kind of a king was he? You see, in Judea, there had been other uprisings. There were rebels who had tried to lead their people against the Roman Empire, but it always ended the same way. Their attempts to become king had fallen short. It was earlier that week. It was on Palm Sunday, earlier that week, when we saw that triumphal entry. Jesus had entered the land, and he came into the city to a great deal of fanfare. He came into the city riding on a donkey, and the crowd shouted praises to his name. You see, it was the Jewish festival of Passover. They celebrated a time at Passover that remembered something that had happened centuries earlier. Centuries earlier, this people of Israel, they had escaped another king. They had escaped the king Pharaoh. They had escaped him with power. They had put Pharaoh in his place. I think they wanted to do the same to us in Rome. And the Passover time was always a time of high emotion in Jerusalem. Jesus had ridden into the city on that day on a donkey just a week earlier, and the crowds went wild. They shouted praises to his name. The members of the Jerusalem High Council were not pleased with this. They tried to quiet the crowds, and as I saw this scene unfold, I remember wondering, if the crowds would get out of hand this week. You see, we were always on edge during that celebration. The people of the region wanted to be free of Roman authority. They couldn't see that they needed a king, that they needed Rome to provide them with order and security. And it was my job as a soldier to make sure that order was maintained. Before we'd been called in that night for the execution of this king of the Jews, he had already had a difficult night. He'd been before the Jewish council, and then the Jewish council had to make sure that Pilate would allow his death by crucifixion. That was when the guards who'd been on duty at the time started to wonder if this Jesus was a different kind of king. You see, we had been through this before, and we knew what to expect when it came to these so-called kings who ended up being tried and sentenced to crucifixion. And most of the time when Pilate held this kind of a trial, it was a quick order of business. Pilate would talk to the accused, and the accused would do one of two things. The accused would either cry and beg for mercy because they realized they'd offended Rome, or the accused would act with a kind of defiance, and they would curse and they would yell. But from what I'm told, Jesus did neither. And the guards who were on duty at that time knew that he was a different kind of king. He was called a king. The sign said, King of the Jews. I was told Pilate didn't really want to crucify this Jesus, King of the Jews. He tried to free him, and that wasn't like Pilate at all. Pilate was notorious for swift judgments and frequent guilty convictions that warranted execution. But something about Jesus must have struck him. In fact, in an attempt to free Jesus, Pilate even let a man called Barabbas go. And I had heard of Barabbas, and my fellow soldiers, we knew of Barabbas. He was a convicted murderer. He had caused riots. This was the kind of man, Barabbas was the kind of man that we were accustomed to meeting. And this was the kind of man we thought we were meeting in Jesus. By the time we got there, Jesus had already been beaten by the guards who had been on duty. He'd been mocked and humiliated. He'd been wounded, and he was already weary. It was our job to take Jesus to Calvary and perform the execution by crucifixion. At first, because we hadn't heard the stories yet, we didn't notice anything peculiar about Jesus, and we went about our business as usual. But we noticed in the crowd that the crowd had a different response to Jesus. Some in the crowd seemed especially interested in seeing Jesus crucified, and they hurled insults at him and mocked him. But others in the crowd seemed sympathetic, and that was not common. At most of these crucifixions, the crowds were subdued. The people who had been convicted had no friends once they'd received their guilty conviction, because nobody wanted to be associated with him for fear that in being associated with the convicted, they too might suffer the kind of fate that crucifixion was going to bring their friends. But on that day, Jesus had people following him to the cross, either hurling insults or looking at him sympathetically. We had Jesus carry his cross, but we noticed that he was weak, and after he stumbled, we found someone from the crowd who was willing to carry the cross for him. All the while, Jesus' enemies mocked and they yelled, while Jesus' friends showed sympathy. This should have been a sign to me that Jesus was a different kind of king. We took Jesus to the place called Calvary. We nailed him to the cross, and we raised the cross so that he was no longer on the ground. And as he hung there, we did what we as soldiers always do in this instance. We took his clothes and we started to divide them amongst ourselves. I received the sandals. One of my other fellow soldiers had the belt, one received the robe, and one received the scarf. This is how we always did business. And this was part of the sending a message. This problem is Jesus had more. He also wore a tunic, which not everyone wore. And this tunic was not a piece of clothing that you could cut or divide. So rather than argue and divide it, we cast lots to see which one would get the tunic. We were just taking our due. We were just taking our share. This is how we in Rome ruled at that time. This is why I became a soldier. I became a soldier because I wanted to be part of the most powerful empire in the world. I wanted to be someone who was part of that prestige. I wanted to be someone who had others look up to him and respect him because of my status within the empire. If someone tried to defy Rome, they had to meet me and my friends, and their example would serve as a lesson to those who saw us crucify these delinquents. Once they saw us do that, they would not cross us again. We took their lives in front of their family and friends, and we took their belongings as payment for the honor of taking their lives. If I couldn't be a king, I wanted to serve the most powerful king. I wanted to serve someone who would offer me respect and fear. And until that day, it seemed like I was right. But when Jesus, this so-called King of the Jews, hung on the cross, I noticed something different in him. While Jesus hung on the cross, he didn't act like others who were on the cross. When he was questioned by another fellow on the cross, rather than replying with a cross word or ignoring him, he spoke words of comfort and reassurance. He said something to the effect of, "You will be with me in paradise." This is not how anyone acted when they hung on the cross. This is not how people act when they're being mocked. When you're mocked, you're supposed to mock back. You're supposed to be defiant. When you're being questioned, you're supposed to defend yourself. You're supposed to turn the attention to someone else, but Jesus didn't do any of that. And I started to realize, looking back, why Pilate could hesitate to acquiesce to the death sentence for Jesus. Jesus prayed for forgiveness for those who mocked him. But what really struck me and what caused my change of heart was to see what Jesus did in responding to the women who were there at the cross. You see, most of these kings, so-called kings and rebels, while they're hanging on the cross, they cried, they pleaded, they cursed if they had the strength to say anything at all. They were consumed with their own circumstances. And in many ways, I can see in them why they wanted to be kings, why they wanted the power and the prestige of Rome. They were consumed with their own desires, and in their suffering, all they thought about was what they wanted and what affected them, and they were going to throw venom at anyone else who would add to their suffering. I was always smart enough to realize I wasn't meant to be a king. So I aligned myself with the most powerful kings. I thought the most powerful kings meant I would have the most powerful and would give me prestige. But until I saw Jesus on the cross that day, I had never even considered that a king might care for me. Jesus made me reconsider my desire for power, because I started to question, where would that desire lead? You see, the kings that I knew didn't care for their subjects. Herod, living in the land of Judea, he would kill his own family members to hold on to his own power. Pilate had no love for me, even though I served him for years. I'm not even confident he knew my name. He showed no concern for my family. But while Jesus hung on the cross, in what would have been his worst hour, an hour that would have made him feel forsaken by everyone, he looked upon the women there. And he said, "Behold your mother," to one of his followers. And he said to his mom, "Behold your son." He was making sure his mom was taken care of. This was a different kind of king. And ironically, I never would have seen just how unique he was if I hadn't seen him on the cross that day. To hang there and think of others, not his own power, but care and concern for his followers. You see, all other kings who had power, they used their followers to hold on to that power. But Jesus was loved by his followers, and in turn, he loved them. Every king I had seen before him was consumed with power and strength. And I started to realize that the kings I sought to follow weren't going to be a blessing to me. They were just going to use me and consume me. But Jesus, while he hung there on the cross, being consumed by the evil around him, and I later found out he'd done nothing wrong. He didn't deserve this. As he hung there in his own innocence, he was doing it for others. He was caring for others. He didn't rely on military power because military power would rise and fall. But Jesus, in his selfless care for others, showed a refusal to take power, and he ended up with a kingdom that outlasted Rome. I started to realize that day that what I had thought would last, the power, the prestige, the ability to intimidate others, it really wasn't going to get me what I wanted. And what struck me that day as I saw Jesus breathe his last is that he truly was a Son of God, that he truly was a different kind of king. I could follow a king like that. I hope you can too.